Wednesday seminar for the Security Studies program. I'm Taylor Fable, Director of SSP. And today it's really a true pleasure of mine to welcome Jim Fearon from Stanford University. If I have a little bit of a PTSD look on my face, Jim was on my committee. I'm still in therapy, but getting there. No, it's really, so Jim is the Theodore and Francis Jabal professor on Stanford's School of Humanities and Sciences, a professor of political science, a senior fellow in the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's also a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His research, I'm pretty sure, is well known to all of you in this room. That includes civil and interstate war, ethnic conflict, the politics of economic development, and democratic accountability. Today, he's going to speak on the question of what is contemporary interstate conflict about, and really, it's a great pleasure to have you here, Jim. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much, Taylor, and thanks for the invitation. Thanks for coming today. I'm really excited and interested to speak to this group. Really perfect, I think, for getting feedback on this, which is not a paper, and I'm interested in whether it should be or shouldn't be. Noting is or was, I've given this once before, before the election, and as you'll see, quite a bit of the arguments may be overtaken by events in a certain way, or at least it is interesting to ask, and maybe that'll come up in conversation. So yeah, so background, not based on a paper, at least not yet. It does draw on a number of things that I've written or am writing. Most of all, this I/O paper from 2018, and some early precursors, including something that was commenting on Charlie Glazer's book some years ago. And then things in the works, a foreign affairs piece that's coming out that I'll talk a little bit about, or the material from that if I get to the end, co-authored with a terrific civil servant who's really the first author on the piece, who works in DoD, and a handbook chapter, which is not far enough along to, well, I don't know, that's related to what I'm talking about, but not super as far along as it ought to be. So what do I mean by contemporary interstate conflict? Here are the kind of some of the examples that I have in mind, ranging from conflict between the U.S. and Iraq, NATO versus Gaddafi, a couple other examples, but what I'll talk about most of all are U.S. Russia, Russia Ukraine, NATO Russia, and potential U.S. China conflict over Taiwan or perhaps elsewhere. Okay, why ask about this? Well, this audience doesn't really need as much justification as the other audience I gave this to, but well, there seems to be more of it happening, or threatening to happen, especially involving major or great powers, which is scary. There are risks, I think, of a U.S.-China war. There are risks, have been and may yet be risks of a Russia-NATO war, although perhaps that's declined a lot now. I don't know. A second reason to be interested in this question is that a common view in the post-Cold War period was that we didn't really have to worry so much about major power conflict, that it was anachronistic to do so. And from that perspective, the return of major power interstate war risk and arms buildups might be, or is, surprising and puzzling. I think for a lot of kind of capital R realists, their line is, oh, you guys were foolish and silly. Of course, it's always that way. But I actually think it should be surprising and puzzling. There, even from kind of, let's say, some interpretations of realist views, it should be surprising and puzzling, given that we live in a nuclear, post-nuclear revolution. And I actually think there are, arguments about economic interdependence and a quite open international economic system. Reasons for territorial conquest, in addition to nuclear weapons, go down a lot. Okay, and then last, I'm now old enough to have seen this happen before at the end of the Cold War, but we're in one of these phases where some academics and policy analysts and pundits compete to define the next phase of international politics. And we see a lot of this going on now, reasonably, I guess. And these efforts can, at least on some margins, influence what actually happens. It's interesting that Graham Allison's Thucydides trap ideas, arguments that appear to be very popular in Beijing with policymakers there. So I'm going to sketch an answer today and try to discuss a couple examples. The argument in brief is that, which I think it's going to have elements of, but also I'm going to try to contrast it with with two main kind of capital R realist alternatives. What I'm going to argue is that I'm going to stress the threat that powerful democracies pose to the internal stability of autocratic regimes, first, and then second, conflicting preferences stemming from nationalisms, both nationalism that is used instrumentally by autocratic leaders and also quite genuine national sentiment, and the incentives that these first two things give for arms buildups, and in turn, following on that, risks of armed conflict due to, for the most part, preventive war or windows of opportunity type logics. I'll talk about Russia and China, and then hopefully get to some more specific concerns about military risks in a potential conflict over Taiwan. Okay, so the main argument. So major and middle powers sometimes have sharp conflicts of interest. I gotta apologize, I've got a lot of words on these slides, which I know is not optimal, but this is what happens when you kind of write your papers via PowerPoint, which is also not ideal, but life happens. So sometimes major and middle powers sometimes have sharp conflicts of interest, where one or both sides want to change the status quo in some way for reasons that basically have nothing to do with their own national security. Okay, I'm going to say that's a case of conflict where the parties are revisionists rather than status quo states, and where the desires for revision are not about security in the sense of keeping what they have. And I'm going to meaning national security here in this traditional IR sense of territorial integrity within current borders. A couple comments on that. So that's of course not specific. It's not something that's new. By revisionists, I just mean that state leaders want to change something about the status quo outside of their state. Not necessarily that they want lots of new territory. In the IR theory literature, sometimes revisionists used in a more expansive sense to refer to kind of expansionists wanting to take over lots of territory or change the international order, whatever exactly that means. I think this claim should not be controversial, but there are important IR theories of contemporary conflict often say or presume the opposite, I think, or misunderstand, minimize the role of conflicting preferences that are not related to traditional security concerns. That they assume that states are basically status quo powers or motivated only by desire of keeping what they have. In some versions, that's the premise, and like say offensive realism, but that is said to imply very aggressive, or you have to be aggressive to keep what you have type behavior. But in any event, conflict is then a result of a misunderstanding or a mistake, security dilemmas, spirals, and so on. Okay, that was the first step. Again, states often have significant conflicts of interest based on revisionist preferences that don't have anything to do with, have basically nothing to do with traditional national security in this sense of territorial integrity. Because conflict and war are costly and risky for leaders, they can then have strong incentives to make deals, to cut deals, to manage these conflicts of interest, and rather than use force. And most of the time they do this. However, mainly because of the difficulties of making credible commitments in a contract poor, contract deficient environment, the anarchy of international relations, they can have strong incentives to arm up in various ways in order to coerce or be in a better position to bargain or enact changes in the status quo that they want, or forestall being coerced by other states with whom they have these non-security-based conflicts of interest. And then last, getting to where do we actually get armed conflict out of this, potential and actual armed conflict is then mainly the result of preventive war logics related to the arming up incentives. Okay, so to summarize, revisionists on matters not about security per se lead to incentives to arm up, the better to bargain, coerce, deter on these conflicts of interest. And then that leads to, in some cases, preventive war risks related to perceptions of changes in relative power from arming. So I'm going to argue that this schema, with some details filled in, fits well for contemporary interstate conflict. The details that I'm going to focus on for filling in are, first, these days, what exactly are these revisionist non-security-based conflicts of interest? And second, what exactly are the preventive war risks and where do they come from? So, answer to the first thing, what are these non-security based conflicts of interest? Two things these days. And the first one may be changing on some possibly large margin with the Trump administration. First, democracies are intrinsically threatening to dictatorships because it's common knowledge that they would prefer to see the dictatorships transition to democracy, and that dictatorships would prefer that democracies become dictatorships, other things equal. This is particularly problematic when the democracy is, when you've got a really militarily strong democracy like the US, that might be tempted to support opposition in a domestic rebellion in an autocracy, for example, a color revolution. That's an example of a revisionist preference that's not related to national security in the usual sense. At least until now, the US just prefers that other countries be democracies, other things equal. And, for example, there are exceptions for example, in the Cold War where there were other considerations as well. But certainly in the post-Cold War period. From the dictatorship's perspective, the US and the EU, in this sense, are the dangerous revisionists. Okay, and then the second, what are these non-security-based conflicts of interest? Conflicting nationalist claims on territory. The examples that we'll be talking about here are PRC claims on Taiwan versus public sentiment as it has developed in Taiwan concerning nationality, national independence, and then Putin and a lot of Russians' views about Ukraine being an integral part of a greater Russia in one way or another versus Ukrainians' very different understanding of national identity. So, okay, talking first about this first point here. So, claim or assert autocratic leaders are almost always deeply insecure and worry a lot about domestic rebellion and or coups, even when they're very powerful and objectively do have a great deal of control and regime security. They worry a lot, even when they have no obvious domestic contenders or strong opposition and so on. One thing that's happened that I think is relevant here is that over the last 25 years, technological change, internet, cell phones, and so on, objectively favor or can favor opposition coordination and regime threats in a way that, controlling the information space in a way that is very threatening to dictatorships and has complicated autocrats' regime security problem and required them to innovate and spend. So, for example, the CCP has developed this absolutely remarkable surveillance state, which they are increasingly exporting the tools to other autocracies and some democracies. There's a concept that I really like from Benedict Anderson's book, Imagine Communities, called official nationalism, where this is a chapter where he's talking about how mainly with examples from the late 19th century, but also later, how autocrats that had formerly, in the pre-nationalist age, justified their rule in terms of divine right of kings and things like that, or various kind of aristocratic justifications, need to come up with a new story about why they should be the ruler, and they turn to kind of wrapping themselves in nationalist justification. The Kaiser becomes the #1 German, he says. They become the exponent of the nation, whose rule is justified by being the exponent or the exemplar of the nation. I think we increasingly see the invocation of nationalist legacies and missions in Russia, China, Turkey, Egypt, and so on, and which goes along very much on the foreign policy side of things with the argument that if you're opposing the autocrat who is the exponent of the nation, you're working for foreign powers to undermine the nation. Okay. Further, after the end of the Cold War, the US and the EU in particular do a whole lot of things that contribute to autocratic leaders' sense of external risk and threat from unipolar US power through this route of regime security. So most obviously, the US actually uses military force to depose some rulers or autocrats or contribute to it. The US funds and the EU fund all kinds of democracy promotion programs, which alarm and lead to crackdowns starting in the early 2000s, both in Russia and China. There are the Arab Spring uprisings, which are not caused by the US and EU, but supported in various degrees, and also of great concern and alarm in Russia, China, and elsewhere. And then the color revolutions, of which there are, some succeed, some fail, but quite generally, you see evidence that Putin or Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, believe or getting reports that the U.S. has a great deal of has a major hand in these. Just noting a couple examples here. Putin and Xi seem particularly concerned about color revolutions. So in the meeting that took place a couple weeks before the further escalation in Putin's attack in February 2022 in Ukraine, they meet, and their joint statement, which is a fascinating read in general, they say, "We stand against attempts by external forces to undermine security and stability in their regions, counter interference from outside forces into internal affairs of sovereign countries, oppose color revolutions." A few months later, at a SCO meeting, she is reported as saying, it's important not to allow attempts by external forces to provoke a color revolution, reflecting official Chinese anxiety about Western support for pro-democracy, that it's a plot to undermine the Communist Party and other authoritarian governments. This is not new to Xi Jinping entirely, but it certainly escalates. It appears to escalate some after he takes power. There's some another example I find interesting about Putin from this book by Zigar, but it's based on, for example, Burns and about other sources. Putin saw was really affected apparently by the Libya intervention, and he sees it as a chain of revolutions followed by Western military interventions that could eventually reach him. He saw Gaddafi as someone who'd accepted the West terms and yet nevertheless paid the price. He says he was apoplectic when Gaddafi was killed, and was alleged to be kind of obsessed with the footage of Gaddafi's brutal killing. In the same article, also from the Zigar book, Shoigu, the defense minister, said that their intervention in Syria helped solve the geopolitical task of breaking the chain of color revolution. So something they're very, very concerned about. All this is leading autocrats to correctly infer that the US would be perfectly happy if they were overthrown. They have plenty of evidence that the US and friends may actively help support domestic opposition if a rebellion gets going. And even, favored friendly autocrats get worried, with Erdogan very suspicious that the US was involved in the coup attempt there. MBS gets very worried. So from the perspective of an autocrat disfavored by the US and allies and partners are the revisionists. And they're revisionists not about territory. It's not about NATO invading Russia to take it over, grab territory, or divide it up. They're revisionist about regime type. Okay. Now, partly this is a matter of policy choices made by the US and the EU in the post-Cold War period. Partly it's just intrinsic. I'd argue we can, happy to try to discuss that more. Okay, so how do we get to conflict? Well, this underlying revisionist preference by the US and EU, even kind of to some degree independent of what they say their policies are, creates a commitment problem. The US can't credibly commit not to support a domestic uprising against an autocrat, up to, to some extent verbally and with other kind of more low-grade kinds of support, but up to and including military support, as happens, for example, in Libya. For smaller, weaker autocracies like Kim Jong-un in North Korea or Iran, this is just a very dramatic lesson in the value of getting nuclear weapons, if they can. For Russia and China, much bigger powers who are not at risk of, not at the same kind of risk as North Korea or Libya, it leads to a combination of domestic and foreign policies intended to address regime insecurity in this changing technological, political context. Okay, so for Putin, this is campaigns of, going on a kind of counteroffensive with campaigns of misinformation, disinformation, promotion of extremist positions and groups in Europe and the U.S., electoral influence attempts in democracies that are perceived as threatening, a big time embrace of official nationalism in Anderson's sense, embrace of an all-Russian or pan-Russian concept, focus on a military buildup. Russia, one of the elements of official nationalism is to generate kind of pride and I am making the nation strong, and we see that going on as part of what's going on with Russian defense policies. For China, starting with Hu Jintao and then even more with Xi Jinping, broad and deep crackdown on expression and association internally, the Great Firewall, huge expansion of state surveillance and control of individuals, and then increasing efforts to project this control outside of mainland China. When Xi Jinping comes to power, he gives this Chinese dream speech, and the kind of top line, Leninist project goal is rejuvenation of the Chinese nation to be achieved by 2049. Things very much framed in terms of national greatness and centrality, with some stress on we have to remember that backwardness, we were vulnerable to attack by outsiders, and we need to be strong to prevent this. Okay. All right, so far I've been talking about this first non-security based conflict of interest. Democracies are intrinsically threatening to dictatorships. Now let me say a little bit about conflicting nationalist claims on territory. So Putin's and Xi's, I don't think that their nationalism is just instrumental. It's very, very sincere, and I believe very much in accord with the views of millions of their compatriots. On Taiwan, the 1982 Constitution says that this is sacred territory. Very long history here, which people in the room know a lot more about than I do. But as near as I can tell, I guess polling data is tricky here, but seems to be a very, very widely shared view in China. And it's also pretty clear that she sees reunification as being it would be a crowning historic achievement that he would like to be the owner of. Concerning Putin and Ukraine, he writes this interesting essay in June 2021, which I think from reading Russia specialists, there's little reason to think that this is an outlier, or that this is a common view among sincere Russian nationalist views, that Ukraine's not a real state, that Ukrainians are a kind of Russians who speak a dialect, and they're part of like a Slavic, greater Slavic, exactly whether you think of them as Russian or brothers or something, but in any event, it's revisionist relevant view of Ukraine relative to Ukrainians, sense that no, we are a separate independent nation of Ukrainians who are distinct from Russians. So in both cases, selling the idea of great power status to a domestic public is partly an autocratic regime security strategy, but it also represents, it's sellable in part because there's a lot of agreement or willingness to accept this in the population. And genuineness on the part of the leadership, I'm sure. So, okay, to recap, explaining contemporary interstate conflict, we've got revisionists on matters that are not about security per se, leading to incentives to arm up, the better to bargain, coerce, and deter, leading ultimately to preventive war risks related to perceptions and change in relative power. So I've been filling in the details. I talked about what are these revisionist non-security-based conflicts of interest, those two things. Now I'll talk a little bit about preventive war risks and where they're coming from. So I'm going to talk about how you get from revisionism to actual or higher likelihood of actual armed conflict. But first, is anything I'm saying controversial or surprising? I don't think it should be, or not very much. But in the field of IR, some pretty major contenders for interpreting what US-Russia, US-China conflict about are different. On China-US relations, standard frames are, first of all, Allison Mearsheimer, I'd say, a classic case of a rising versus a declining power contending over phrases used are like global domination, hegemony, the international order. Or, Mearsheimer likes to say that the US and China are just acting as any great powers would. No, that's different than the democracy autocracy logic, for example, or the nationalist thing to a great degree that I've been talking about. And then second, you've got arguments about the US-China conflict being an expression of the security dilemma, where the idea here is that China and the US don't really have a very good reason to be at odds militarily, or certainly not as much as they are. And that what we're seeing is this kind of, a misperception spiral in the Jervis type sense, where like each side overreads the aggression and intentions of the other. Okay. On Russia, US, NATO, a common, although debated frame is, I would say, although I think John doesn't like security dilemma, but I would say it's a security dilemma type argument where he says that the US is transfixed by real liberal ideology and then expands NATO, not realizing that that's going to lead to a defensive reaction by a status quo oriented Putin is basically a security dilemma type argument. So let me talk now about Russia versus Ukraine backed by NATO. I can start with the conflict of interest and then go through the next steps in the argument. So I don't think Putin's not just a security seeker who feels threatened by the possibility of NATO expansion to Ukraine. He has very strong nationalist preferences and an ideology that claims Ukraine and Belarus as parts of a greater Russia of some kind. He thinks that Ukrainians are not a real nation in this view. He was absolutely threatened and angry about NATO expansion, but not primarily because of the threat of NATO attack on Russia. Instead, because NATO and EU and Western alignment of Ukraine go against his revisionist nationalist preferences concerning Ukraine and Russia as a great power. Revisionist relative to the recognition, including by Russia, of Ukraine as an independent state, after the breakup of the Soviet Union. He's also likely threatened by the prospect of a democratic and more prosperous Ukraine tied to Western economic networks, as this would be a bad example for his subjects. At the same time, on the other side, and especially since 2014, the US and its allies and partners are clearly revisionist in terms of trying to move Ukraine out of the Russian sphere of influence and domination towards democracy and economic integration with Europe. The Ukrainian leadership and public, a large majority, have their own nationalist vision that emphatically rejects Putin and Russian view of Ukrainians as a kind of Russian. They want national self-determination and control of territory they claim is Ukrainian. US leaderships, not, it seems, Trump during his first term and not now, just prefer democracy and economic integration of Ukraine into Western Europe, independent of, I think, independent largely of strict national security considerations. You know, whether Ukraine is in a Russian sphere of domination or integrated into Western Europe doesn't really affect, in the narrow sense that I defined it earlier, U.S. national security that much. It didn't during the Cold War, and it's not obvious why it would now. It's a revisionist, non-security based preference, which I agree with personally myself. So next step leads to Ukrainian incentives to arm and Russian preventive incentives, knowing what Putin wants and was taking by force since Crimea. Ukrainian leaders have had strong incentives to build military capability to counter threats and coercion by Russia. This is arming up. This is true regardless of whether Ukraine is in or out of NATO. And Ukraine was indeed building military capability, in particular, or I would emphasize in particular missile capability in the wake of 2014 and the war that followed. Putin could see that Ukraine was going to keep at this regardless of the NATO question. He could also see that negotiated deals to try to limit or stop growing missile and military capabilities in Ukraine would be difficult to monitor and enforce, given the underlying revisionist preferences of Ukrainian governments and Western countries' underlying preferences. He thought he could lock in more of what he wanted by acting militarily in February 2022, despite the costs and risks, which, another component here is that they underestimated them. Oh, they were not the only ones underestimating them. All right. Was there some kind of negotiated deal possible? I have a hard time imagining how that would work, given what's ultimately, like I said, changing preferences, changing relative power, difficulty of contracting in this environment. It would have required U.S. and Western European states to credibly commit to limit Ukraine's military capability and economic integration to a degree acceptable to Putin. I don't know how you make that credible given preferences. How do you monitor and enforce it? It'd be walking some very difficult line with a lot of judgment calls, not possible you could really write down in a complete contract. Likewise, if you could, limit, come to something that limits their military capability and economic integration, how does Putin Russia commit not to use the military imbalance to coerce more change in the direction that he wants, given his preferences? So pessimistic that there was like some kind of deal like that possible. Now, note, you could have had a deal if one side is willing to just concede on its non-security based revisionist preferences. I kind of read John as saying that's what US and NATO should have done because the US just shouldn't care about democracy and economic prosperity and links to Europe in Ukraine. But if given conditional on those preferences, you just have these consequent commitment problems and then war risk coming from the incentives to arm up and the preventive incentives that follow on that. Okay, a little bit on China and Taiwan. So we all probably know about the nationalist claims on Taiwan and how, at least verbally, how long Chinese leaders have emphasized their centrality and importance to their long-run legitimacy and success of the regime. I'm, happy to take feedback from people who know more about this than I do, but I would guess that Xi Jinping are probably threatened by a prosperous democratic Han country as an alternative model. We do have polling data from Taiwan, and it shows a quite large and solid shift to a solid majority against incorporation in PRC. And I think that, U.S. administrations, at least until now, probably still now, I don't know, prefer Taiwan to stay democratic and politically and economically de facto independent. I think that that's a straight policy preference. I mean, you make kind of domino arguments about how that are, more about how U.S. national security is, Taiwan status quo is critical for that, or really important. You can make arguments that losing Taiwan significantly increases PRC ability to exert military and economic pressure on U.S. allies and partners in the region that are important in turn for U.S. economic well-being. I'm kind of doubtful of that, although another point I'm interested in hearing views on. But independent of that question, I think the simple policy preference of the non-security based, we prefer a democratic and de facto economically independent Taiwan has been enough to this point to make the U.S. want to sustain and strengthen deterrence as it's put in the Biden administration national defense strategy. Okay, next step, arming incentives on all sides. Over 20 plus years, the PRC has been engaged in a very, very large military buildup and modernization program that is highly focused on Taiwan contingency. The U.S. and Taiwan have been in a position of playing catch up, having focused on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism for 20 years. It's an extremely, as you all know, extremely difficult military problem on both sides. Massive amphibious invasion for the PLA, very long distance and very tough anti-access area denial, Chinese missile capability from the mainland in terms of undermining the traditional U.S. means of power projection there with a surface navy for U.S. allies and partners. This is just a picture of the A2AD problem, which has gotten worse and worse as China has made really, really big investments in missile capability, and the U.S. has been slow for various reasons to figure out how to deal with that. It may be possible to get to a stable deterrent relationship. I think it should be possible to get to a stable, mutual deterrent relationship in the Western Pacific, but it's a risky and dangerous path. Where the risk of preventive action come from? Well, all kinds of stuff could happen in Taiwan domestic politics. The U.S. may be doing or could do things which, end up provoking action by the Chinese. The PRC may perceive at some point a closing window of opportunity or an opening of a window of opportunity, depending on things that might happen in the Trump administration, for example. We just don't know. Now, let me say a little bit about contrasting this to the kind of Alison Mearsheimer type take. I totally agree that rapid economic and military rise of PRC has been a critical factor in increasing frictions and war risks between the U.S. and the PRC. But I think the militarization is mainly because of, one, these conflicting preferences over Taiwan and the logic just spelled out there. And second, PRC arming up as a contribution to regime security via official nationalism at home and this genuine fear of implications of U.S. preference for rebellion in China. This is something I'm in the process of trying to learn more about and I'm interested to hear views on it, but I see a lot of evidence for this, for example, in stuff that Sheena Greitens writes or Susan Shirk's book Overreach and a number of other places. Let me contrast, so that's contrast to Alison and Mearsheimer, contrast it to security dilemma accounts. The PRC leadership appears to see their operations around Taiwan as defensive deterrent signals. They are concerned about saying, about trying to deter moves in the direction of independence. They're very concerned that U.S. Defense policy will encourage DPP to take liberties that they would find unacceptable. On the other side, PLA operations, or increasing PLA operations around Taiwan and in the South China Sea, are often read by US commentators as kind of confirming or supporting that, oh, they're preparing to invade. So I'd agree that there's an element of a security dilemma spiral here, in the sense of overestimation of the other side's aggressive intent. But I don't think that's the heart of the problem, or where the risk and danger is really coming from. So let's ask, why not a deal that would, why can't we solve this with some kind of negotiated agreement? How about a deal that brought Taiwan formally into the PRC, but also guaranteed political and economic autonomy sufficient to accommodate the Taiwanese? Quite plausible, I think, that China, Taiwan, the US, the region would prefer that to the risks and costs of another gigantic Pacific War, which could be absolutely ruinous. But the PRC can't credibly commit to observe the terms of such a deal, in part because a lively and prosperous Han democracy would be threatening to the regime. It's hard for me to see how you can negotiate some kind of stable compromise in, an intermediate solution. It just wouldn't be enforceable. So I think it's driven to kind of an all or nothing situation. One side, either status quo or, incorporation on Beijing's terms. That in turn is driving an arms race and a force posture competition. Both sides arming up. This is the arming up part of the argument. The PRC ideally to become so clearly strong that they can win without fighting. Taiwan, US, Japan, Australia, et cetera, in hopes of deterrence. So why not make a deal to limit or stop the arms competition and risks associated with that? The US can and should signal, I think, to PRC that it's putting pressure on the DPP to maintain status quo. But how could the PRC commit not to take advantage of a US agreement not to arm Taiwan for deterrence, given their revisionist preferences and the large and growing military capabilities of their state? So arms racing does not necessarily lead to war. It could lead to stable deterrence. Putin jumped through what he thought was a window of opportunity before Ukraine armed up, especially with longer range missiles. Something like that could happen in the Taiwan case, but not necessarily. I am concerned, and this will be closing, I guess. I am concerned that a bunch of particular military facts about the situation in the Western Pacific make for some very large first strike incentives in the region. U.S. forces are vulnerable to missiles, PLARF missiles. Taylor, do we say PLARF or do?
Well, it rhymes with something else. So, but yeah, PLARF or PLARF or. I'm old school. I prefer the second artillery. It was just, but it wasn't a force, so we can't.
Okay. So this vulnerability on the U.S. side creates a potential incentive, or a real incentive, to strike Chinese mainland missiles and radar sites and ports early on, together with PLA capabilities for finding and targeting U.S. ships and assets. The new combatant commander, or the current combatant commander in Indo-PACOM, said in his confirmation testimony that he needs capabilities to blind blinding to protect his forces and manage their operations. At the same time, the PRC wants to quickly take Taiwan because time allows the U.S. to mobilize and flow forces to the region, which makes their plans much more difficult. So they have incentives for quick attacks on U.S. forces in the region to blind, exactly parallel to blind U.S. ability to target their A2, AD, and joint island landing campaign assets. So we have a situation where two nuclear states have incentives operationally to blind each other very quickly at the outset of a conflict, in the context of a major missile and naval exchange, this is really very scary to me. So the implication, and this is what this thing coming out in foreign affairs is about, U.S. allies and partners in the region need to work to develop secure conventional second strike capabilities, together with increased Taiwanese capabilities to deny an invasion. So that's it.
Thanks, Jim. That was terrific. So the floor is open. Ken, I saw your hand first. So first question to Ken Oy. Everyone else, please keep your hands up.
Okay, Jim, a compelling presentation that would have been totally convincing in October of 2024. So their main argument on the significance of revisionist democracies in conflict with authoritarian states holds. It's certainly true. The US and the EU and its tensions with Putin, with Xi, with Assad, Gaddafi during earlier periods. The list goes on, Erdogan and others. But in October of 2024, we would have all been nodding yes and agreeing. But has Trump flipped the table in ways that we as political scientists don't necessarily like, okay? But has he in fact changed American foreign policy? So we're no longer revisionists. In fact, our buddies are the former deplorables. And at the same time, he also seems to be trying to change the characteristics of the United States. Level 2, being less democratic now than in the past. So the basic question here is pretty straightforward. At the level of practical politics, has Trump changed the table? How much of the presentation has to be revised in ways that we would not have expected, given our usual arguments on constraint? And to what extent do we have to revise our thinking in international relations to take account of what appears to be an extraordinary set of developments within the United States, challenging our conventional wisdoms on the power of image one, on the significance of an ability to change other elements, on our sense of structure?
Okay.
Go on. Yeah.
Thanks, Ken. Yes, agree with a lot there. I'd say, in thinking about what are the implications of the change of government, possibly regime in the US, yes, an implication of these arguments would be that we should see some decrease in major power conflict risks for the reasons you suggest. A couple things I'd say, though. I don't think that either Putin or Xi Jinping, I would be doubtful that they would put full confidence in the US policy position not changing again. They have good reason to think that we're all over the place, and that in between 5 and 10 years, we could be back to where we were before. They are probably well aware of how much, you could say, muscle memory the US has for the kind of policies that I was talking about here. But yeah, so I expect their approach would be to take as much as they can possibly get from Trump, which appears to be a lot.
Yeah.
Or it's certainly in Putin's case, but not, but while, grab what they can, but not assume that, the US is going to be permanently their friend and regime supporter. You say, does it, what are the implications? I'm never like answering kind of what are the implications for IR questions, but I'd say in some ways, I mean, if we see this as a movement in the direction of democracy to autocracy, in some ways, like the predictions of democratic peace theory, such as it is, are being borne out. I mean, you're seeing an autocratic move accompanied by, like, let's take Canada, you know, and a whole bunch of stuff like that. So, I mean, yeah, it's not really IR's business to, you know, make predictions about U.S. domestic politics, or at least I don't see it that way, at least not in the first instance. But I'm not sure that, you know, anything. I think if you have a kind of dyed-in-the-wool capital R realist take that wants to totally discount regime type. I mean, I'm giving you a story where regime type is really central. And I think, yeah. So
Great. Damien.
Yeah, thank you for a great presentation. And my question is 100% IR. So that is like, how does this set of explanations relate to some of your and other scholars, like early works on rationalist explanation of the work, which involves some ideas of information symmetry, minimum problem, and indivisibility of like bargaining issue. For example, like how much they overlap with each other. You have mentioned that there is a commitment problem between democracies and autocracies, and I can also imagine that like regime security might be an invisible bargaining issue between autocracy for autocratic leaders. And on the other hand, does this new framework add some new elements to the old one, or does it revise the old framework to some extent?
okay, thanks, Damien, and great to see you here. I think so. You're referring to that 95 paper. The 95 paper is a model of, or an argument about revisionist states. Okay, the line that they're bargaining over, explicit in that is that each side wants more. For they just want it, right, and not necessarily for some kind of instrumental security reasons, but just because they want more territory or whatever it is that the issue it is that they're bargaining over. So I see that as, starting from the premise here, which is that, yeah, part of what's going on here is, me arguing with Jervis and the security dilemma folks like my friend Charlie here. Not that I don't think that these are, Jervis was right, or that what he talks about is important and right, but I think that viewing international politics at security politics as being kind of like the core of it being about major powers being unsure about each other's, whether they're greedy or security seekers, and misperceptions thereof being the, what it's about is not a good starting, not the I think it's better to start in a place of like, these kind of uncertainties are not really where we should start, but rather from a world where there are just these, conflicting non-security based preferences that they need to work, either resolve by negotiations or, arm up and fight over, or both, in a context where it's difficult to make, where a lot of these problems are hard to resolve because of anarchy and the difficulty of contracting there. So I would say I didn't mention, except briefly in a reference to Putin's thinking about invading Ukraine, any kind of informational center. So yes, so I would say I'm downplaying. I mean, not that I don't think those are important, but I think the commitment issues are more important that talked about here, and the incentives those give for arming and the problems that creates for preventive incentives and preemptive incentives are highlighted here relative to what was talked about in that article, although that was there. Yeah.
So speaking of Charlie Glazer, Charlie Glazer.
Well, I just want to say for the record that I completely agree with you on Taiwan, and it's not a security dilemma. So on that one, we have to work it out separately. But my question was, you focused a lot on conflict coming out of the disagreements, of the nationalist disagreements and so forth. But you didn't say how you get conflict out of the threat to autocracies and vice versa. So I was wondering, I mean, you can have this, you have this kind of this kind of competition of misinformation and so forth. But do you see more coming out of that, or just that will create tensions between those states and uneasiness? But it's still a long way to get there to war, I think. So I was just curious, how do you?
I think you're right. I kind of suggested it, but I don't know. I think you're pushing on something that needs more. I would say that the regime security stuff seems to feed into incentives, the official nationalism, the arming motivations. Not to say it's the only reason that either Putin or Xi Jinping arms up, but it seems to me that that they both often connect that, especially I think Xi Jinping and his predecessor, more him, to we need to be strong in part to prevent these external attempts to overthrow our regime. And so it becomes kind of part of a, I don't know, security state rationale.
Caitlin.
Thanks for a really thought-provoking talk. I have a clarification question and then a real question. The clarification question is, do you see this argument as being all about the post-Cold War period, or is this argument kind of about what interstate conflict could have been about in the Cold War too? And the reason I ask is it seems like a lot of the variables that you're talking about actually were present in the Cold War, but of course they didn't produce major power wars. I just kind of wanted to know how you were thinking about that. And the second thing I just wanted to push on a bit is this premise that what's really at the heart of it here, driving conflict, is preferences that don't have to do with traditional security motives. And I think, if you're going to develop this as a full-fledged paper, it would be beneficial to really treat, traditional security motives as a serious competitor and kind of rule that out. Because when I hear your story about the Ukraine case, and I'm not here defending Putin, and you can push back on everything I'm about to say, but when I hear that a neighbor through which I've been invaded multiple times is about to have long-range missiles stationed on its territory linked to an opposing alliance, do I need a whole story about Russian nationalism and autocracy and everything to explain why I might jump on a window before the military balance changes? Or is that just a security motive to do something that is aggressive, but I don't need all these other variables to explain? And so I guess I want to hear more about that alternative explanation of just straight that there are security motives to do this, and that's why you get conflict in Ukraine and maybe you haven't in Taiwan.
Okay, thanks. Really good questions. Let me start with the second one. I think there are a good number of indications that the Russian military and Putin, they worry a lot about NATO forces. This is true. Do they worry about an invasion? This is harder. I mean, if they were really concerned about being attacked by NATO, then it's kind of hard to understand why. Well, okay, why they're doing what they're doing in Ukraine, where they've absolutely overwhelmingly exposed themselves. If they didn't think they were well protected by nuclear weapons, they would be totally vulnerable. If that was really a major concern, this goes back farther. There's a nice piece by Kimberly Martin in this NATO edited volume where she says, look, I really don't see the evidence that the way they've built and postured their forces over 25 years is suggestive that they really are worried about, except in some air defense things, which they seem to have a particular allergy about. But so that's what I'd say on that. On the first thing, the Cold War, yes. I mean, not only the Cold War, the 19th century Europe. The French Revolution kicked things off in a way that now autocrats were fearful of this template or model of a popular rebellion in this city that will cut the king's head off, right? And this freaks out the the old regime for 100 years in Europe. Yes, so it's an old thing. The Cold War, yes, also, and I think I don't know if there's this really nice piece by Jervis called "Was the Cold War Really a Security Dilemma?" which is worth reading, where I think he comes to a position similar to this. I mean, I'm self-interested, right? But that it was revisionist on both sides, and I think some of the perceived threat on the Soviet side was a regime security threat. More than they will invade us, or they would invade us to change our regime type thing. Yeah, I mean, the Cold War is more complicated because it's not like the U.S. was only doing democracy promotion. There was this other dimension of we'll support anti-communist dictators. So yeah.
Right, I saw you dangle two fingers. Is this also your one finger?
Yes.
Okay, over to you.
I basically had an extension of Phelan's question of exactly what you said, because this must go all the way back to the French Revolution. I guess what I would add on to it then to ask is, the tenor I take away from this talk is that this ideological distinction between democracies and dictatorships, as I hear it, is sort of the key dividing line in global politics that is driving these everything else. And I guess my question would be, why is that the key dividing line now? Obviously, it was present in previous periods of history, but I don't know if we could say it was the single dividing line. And so why is it that becomes so salient now?
I mean, so post-Cold War, collapse of the Soviet Union and unipolarity is part of the story, and then another part is nuclear revolution. And whereas before 1945, and I don't know, up to the 60s or something, well, let's say before 1945, we're just in a really different world where you can use conventional force to roll into the capital city of another major power. And it's a world where allying with another state doubles your capabilities to do that. And that makes for I'd say a different kind of international politics than what we've had since then. And part of the thing here is this puzzle of it should be puzzling to us IR folk, how are we getting serious risks of a big war in a world where you really can't, it's not like the US is going to roll into Beijing or vice versa. How does that happen? So I think that's so yeah. So I'm not saying it's just the same as ever, or that this has always been. I think these are things that have kind of yeah, where we are in terms of Michael. What are the conflicting preferences behind which that are the first step in this chain of an argument about what contemporary interstate conflict has been about, at least till now, in the last 25 years or so.
Rich Nielsen. Hey.
Hi.
You mentioned kind of almost offhand that autocrats have preferences for democracies to become autocrats, and then most of the presentation really focuses on this democratic revisionism. Is that a symmetric problem or an asymmetric problem in the model you have in mind? So symmetric, then I think I know what the problem looks like. But I thought it might be asymmetric, where the asymmetric version is that autocratic revisionism is primarily a response to democratic revisionism. Democrats have a clearer sense of what they want the internal politics of other states to look like. Autocrats just want other states to not mess with them, so they don't actually care which flavor of autocracy you are. And so I should imagine a less uniform set of preferences from the one side of revisionists than from the other side of revisionists. And this then I thought might even get to some of Ken's question of what should be revised in the presentation, because building up the other side of this revisionism might speak to more of the current American moment.
The other side being the
Building up the autocratic case for revisionism and saying
the
whether
autocrats' interest in changing.
changing democracies, which
Yeah.
one narrative about
Yes, there is.
Russia and U.S. relations at the moment.
Yeah, no, this is, you're right that I don't talk about that here, and I say that I think, you know, the threat that democracies pose to autocracies is partly a matter of policy. You know, in principle, the U.S. and the EU didn't have to do all this democracy promotion stuff and so on, but it's partly intrinsic in the sense that, you know, a well-off functioning democracy is an object lesson potentially for an autocrat's people that they worry about if their people are unhappy. And if you look at Russian or Chinese domestic propaganda, propaganda, there's this, you know, I was reading these relevant chapters in this recent book by Aaron Baggett Carter and Brett Carter is really good on this. They spend a great deal of time telling their publics about how terrible things are in the US and how elections don't work and you know, everything else is broken and so on. For which they have a lot to draw on, especially now. There's an interesting line in their chapter about Russia about how a lot of Rossiya Gazeta is like basically repeating what Donald Trump says about America. But anyway, yeah, so I think it's partly intrinsic and that it wouldn't really, you know, it's not just a matter of like lack of restraint in US foreign policy. Is that addressing your question?
I imagine there's partly.
We've got time. So
I'm not sure how long the queue is. So imagine that we switch the labels democracy and autocracy. Is the story the same? So if we have the US and EU being autocracies, and there are a set of rising democracies, Russia and China, does everything hold? Or like, do the autocrats then go meddle in the same way, have these revisionist preferences for the rising powers, domestic politics, or is something different? And I sensed that for me, something felt different, and that felt asymmetric.
I'm sure that there's differences and asymmetries, but at this kind of, you know, at a very underspecified counterfactual, not to, you know, that's where you got to start. But no, I think like what is autocratic world order? What do they want? They want a club where the autocrats help, you know, reinforce each other in power. So, and this was, you know, Metternich and you saw this in the 19th century. And that in your counterfactual, the autocratic EU and US, they would have, I think, you know, they would have incentives to prefer autocratic leaders who would not be critical of them and not pose an alternative model of rule.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you have a two-finger?
I was just gonna ask you to repeat the name of the book you just mentioned that talks about the.
I don't remember the name, but Carter and Carter.
Carter. Can all think?
Yeah. Thanks for the talk. Since you have opened up like unit level variables, I was wondering like there might be other variables which are also doing some work but might be difficult to disentangle the effect. So like ideology, leader characteristics, and they came sprinkled in different parts of your talk. So like Putin has certain beliefs about Ukraine and nationalism. Xi Jinping has certain beliefs, right? And even for Trump may seem threatening to some, but not threatening to some. So how can you eliminate that kind on ideology? The liberal ideology of Joe Biden may seem more threatening to Putin than whatever Trump has to offer. So how can you disentangle these regime type variables from other unit level variables like leader characteristics, ideology?
Well, I'm not saying that that is not a consequential source of variation or trying to dismiss it. I mean, I've talked to China specialists who tell me that they think it was kind of an accident that, well, or that Xi Jinping was chosen as general secretary, and that if they'd chosen someone different, things could be really different. I think that could be true. I think there's all kinds of weird, random stuff in U.S. politics that, have led to this particular person with, I don't think, Trump is like an expression in some ways. He's in many ways a symptom rather than a cause, but in some ways, like, say his view on tariffs, like, that's really unusual, right? So yeah, so I agree. There's all kinds of these kind of idiosyncrasies, but I don't know. That's kind of the way social world works, yeah.
Let's see, Devin.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've pretty much answered this, so you don't have to answer it again. But I was going to ask to talk a little bit more about this, exactly the threat that democracies pose to autocracies, and whether it's an intrinsic sort of just like the existence of a democracy out there, the existence of Taiwan or a prosperous Ukraine on Russia's border, or in which case, there's nothing to be done. Like if they're going to be democratic and be prosperous, they're going to pose this threat. Or is it a matter of sort of the particular, either policy choices or a certain flavor of democracy, a sort of universalist flavor of democratic ideology, that if a different version of that ideology, a different democratic ideology were less universalistic, that said, okay, well, Taiwan's ready for democracy, but China's not, or something, that wouldn't be threatening in any way. And I will say Taiwan is an interesting case here because, to some degree, the threat or the interest that Taiwan has had in regime change in China has decreased, I would say, probably over time.
Sorry, the interest in what?
Taiwan's interest in regime change in China
Yeah.
has decreased over time as it has kind of relinquished its sort of like nationalist, and as it has become more democratic. So those two things have kind of moved in different directions. The object lesson or the example has increased in threateningness, whereas like the regime change threat, which may never have been that great anyway without U.S. support, has decreased.
I do think that there is an element of nothing to be done, that there is an intrinsic, that part of the, the non-security based in the, traditional territorial integrity sense, democracies are threatening to autocracies and vice versa. There is a kind of an intrinsic thing there that doesn't, that cannot be eliminated entirely by a declaratory policy. I don't think, the Biden administration did try to say in the national security strategy and various other pronouncements that it was not interested in regime change in China. It said we want to compete in places where we think we need to, where we have disagreements, and work together on these, things like climate change and so on. But I think given this underlying or intrinsic thing, and also just the general, I don't know, say paranoia or I mean, maybe not paranoia, but the very real and overriding concern with domestic rebellion that autocrats typically have, even relatively strong governments, that there are just limits there. And so it's not that there's nothing to be done, but what is to be done is deterrence, if you think it's worth the lift, say on Taiwan. You say is Taiwan? Yeah. So U.S. leaders can, there are margins on which you can help, or like maybe mitigate or make nice in ways that are reassuring to the autocrats. But I mean, these can involve real concessions on things you don't want to concede on, like human rights, or things where you have to weigh, like, how much do I care about this non-security based preference versus this other thing. But so I'd say, some of both, but in the end, I don't think that leaders of genuine democratic governments can just say, like, oh, we pose no threat to you, and have them totally believe that.
And the Chinese case, too, right? You had all of the Trump cabinet speeches in 2020, right before the Biden team comes in, which were all very much regime change
Yeah.
speeches, right?
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
like, okay, I'm going to group folks now because we're getting a little close on time. So let's see, Dan, Siebel, and Jim Walsh. So your question and answer, Jim Walsh and Mike Pazanski.
Well, thanks for the talk. This whole Caitlin's clarifying question is really my substantive question. She thinks she has better questions. She said, "Is this post Cold War phenomenon?" Because I thought that's what you were going to say, and you said no. It's generally true, and it's sort of a characteristic that you might even want to call. It's almost a constant. You know, if you're a democracy for a long time, then you're a democracy. And in answer to the follow-up, well, this doesn't seem like a big deal prior to the Cold War. It was other things that seemed to drive this. Your response was nuclear weapons and the Cold War. But nuclear weapons haven't changed. And so I'm wondering, is this because the security dynamics changed to allow what was a constant but not very important to percolate up? In other words, it was always there, but wasn't a big deal. Now it's a big deal. It seems like it's the cause of the non-security, rise of non-security conflict is because the security condition changed. Or maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Did you say you were in group questions or?
Yes. So that's question one.
Okay.
All right, yeah, so mine's kind of related to potential conflation between fears of regime change and regime security, and that being driven specifically by the clash of regime type. So you already mentioned during the Cold War, there was lots of covert regime promotion of autocracies. Even now we have autocratic allies despite summits of democracies and things like that. Russia interfered in our elections, of course, in 2016. So if fear of regime change is separable from the regime type drive, I don't know if it would change your argument that much. It might just be a little less ideologically driven. So I think you're totally right that Russia and China are fearful of regime change. I don't know that we need the clash of regime type to get there, in other words. I don't want your thoughts on that. Thanks.
You mean you don't think, does there need to be a democracy autocracy component?
Exactly, right. So the fears of rebellion, color revolutions, sovereignty considerations, all that I buy. I just don't know that given the US track record and the fact that we have autocratic allies now, it might be more of some other clash of interests and a fear of regime change, just to change the preferences of the regime, not being driven by a desire to see democracy.
I think about that. Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't think. I mean, it would be clearly wrong to argue that the U.S. only has bad relations with autocracies and only good relations with democracies. That's not been true. It's not true now. So I don't see it as absolute. It's more of an other things equal thing. I guess is the suggestion that the stuff the U.S. does or has done and the EU have done that Putin and Xi Jinping find threatening, that the democracies of is just window dressing and they're doing it to undermine military challengers?
So basically that it could be driven by innate preference to see China and Russia become a democracy. But I could kind of Alex Downs' work. I could have an interest in regime change just to change their preferences. In other words, they're antagonistic.
Which preferences?
The preferences of China and Russia towards the U.S. So they're antagonistic towards the U.S. If I change the regime, I might get a more friendly.
I guess I'd want to know more about which preferences, right? So, yeah. And what were their origins? Jim Walsh. So, I mean, you guys are pressing on really good things for me to think more about, and this contrast with the Cold War. I'm ambivalent about whether I say it was a big deal. I mean, during the Cold War, I think it was a big part of the Cold War. I think there was a big element of. I mean, in the 50s, in the U.S., there was tremendous fear about communism, overthrowing our government. you know, symmetrically to a non-trivial degree on the Soviet side. So I don't know, I'm a little ambivalent on that. I mean, communism, people really believed in it for a while there, and that gave a certain kind of a strength to the Soviet regime that is, you know, you see Putin and Russia kind of Putin groping for like, what is the legitimating story? That might be a difference. Yeah.
Great. So next two gentlemen in the front here, and then John Caverly.
Yeah, so I think my question really builds up on what was just said, and that, but maybe go a bit deeper, and that is like, how much do we actually need this democracy variable in the sense of what was also mentioned before? Taiwan was not always a democracy, right? But the interest of China to take over Taiwan has been there for a longer time. And so basically, to counterfactual, if Taiwan today was strongly sovereign, right, but autocratic, would that mean that China would just say, well, that's fine with us? Or, and then I wondered throughout this talk, how much is this actually about this nationalism kind of question? And how much is it about really democracy versus autocracy?
Well, I think on Taiwan, yes, it's not like the only reason that it's far from, yeah, definitely not saying that the only reason Beijing would like to reunify with Taiwan is because they're threatened by Taiwanese democracy. Certainly not. As I was saying, this is ethnic nationalism, and like it belongs to China. It is China. Those are Chinese people. Is the core thing. I do think the democracy thing, though, it's a problem in that, you know, if you were trying to explore negotiated settlements to resolve the conflict, that is an issue where how can Taiwanese people, how could they be confident that, you know, especially after seeing Hong Kong, that, you know, one country, two systems has any real possibility? And so they do care about that. It's become part of it has over time become part of their, as it were, national identity.
John.
So this is an attempt to sort of theorize what Jim is saying. It seems like you have these two parallel mechanisms. One is the difference in ideologies or regime, and the other is nationalism. They're kind of working in parallel. And it did seem to me that you're making sort of a causal argument that these forces are rising, and then you're getting more security competition. And so if that's the case, then
which forces are rising? Sorry,
the nationalism, like this nationalistic idea that nationalism is more salient, or it's become more intense, and it becomes more of a security matter for these regimes. Or are you saying that's not it? You're just describing. I think that's one of the questions we're all asking you. Are these constants, and therefore they're not causal? Because then there's got to be something else. Or are they actually?
Well, I think in the Taiwan case, the nationalism and the nationalist claims have always been there since 1949 and before, I suppose. Well, no, not before. But what's changed is that China's become much more militarily and economically powerful. So if you want to, you know, go back to my 95 article, right? The status quo used to be, you know, the PRC's military option used to be way over here, and as they've grown in power, now we're getting into a range where it could be that they prefer military action to the status quo. And so what's changed is not the preference; that's always been there. What's changed is the military balance. It is changing.
I think that's really
now whether there's been an increase in intensity of nationalist territorial disputes, probably if you actually code this, it's actually been a decline. I mean, over the long haul. You know, looking at what happened at the end of World War II and at the end of World War I. But I don't know if I mean, I make some claims which are probably testable. I don't know if I'm going to be the one to test them. Maybe I will. About autocratic leaders increasingly kind of resorting to official nationalist justifications. That I think you could claim with some of the methods that Rich knows about. I think it would bear out, but I don't know for sure.
Great. So, Nils, who I saw, I think your hand come up. And then Eric and Maria, you get the first questions at lunch. Since I know you're coming to lunch, you'll get another bite at the apple. So, Nilsu.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the more recent questions, and my thought was, would then your scope be that there needs to be this conflicting states need to have like a nationalist claim over a territory? So like, would we be able to generalize your claims to adversarial states that do not have like an identity related claim over a territory? As in like, does this only apply to territories that other countries claim to be theirs or have some related interests in identity wise?
Mm-hmm. Should I take the other one or do you?
No,
okay. Thanks. I for the last for the handbook chapter, I spent a little while looking at which militarized interstate disputes have had the the most of them or the longest duration over the last 75 years, and overwhelmingly it is countries that have a nationalist dispute over territory. Overwhelmingly. But I don't know. Do you have a particular example in mind of where it's not that?
And that's why I was just thinking, can I take this theory and apply it to a context where the war is not against a territory that used to be belonging to the, say like Russia or China? There's a huge nationalist claim there, which it makes me think that that's a part of the scope condition. I just don't know how I would apply this to elsewhere. So is it really that the worry is because a territory they feel is theirs is turning towards a potential more threatening regime type? I don't know if that makes sense, but
it's that they, as a territory they think is theirs, it should be in their state, independent of regime type.
I was also thinking of recently for like Northern Cyprus, for instance, the regime there was going more democratic, which Erdogan didn't like. So he brought in a bunch of immigrants from Turkey that support him so that the election results would change. And now we have a pro-Erdogan supporting government in Northern Cyprus because they feel that's part of their territory and they don't want a regime type that's not going to be favoring them. So maybe it's not a war case there, but it's still, they really don't want it, but perhaps it's relating to this needs to be happening in a place where there's nationalism, or like if there's a precondition of like there needs to be nationalist claims. So maybe that.
Well, yeah, I don't think that nationalist disputes in the Gellner et cetera sense of disagreements about where a border is and that the based on a view that the one nation nations should be enclosed by borders and not and you should not be ruled by non-nationals. I think that's a lot of what's going on, and that the IR field in general doesn't conceptualize or talk about this in very well. But I wouldn't say that that's the only thing that interstate conflict is about. But yeah, it would be good to think about what's a good case that's clearly not that. And I think there are, but yeah.
Great. Well, we're at time, Jim. Thank you so much. That was terrific. Everyone, please join me in thanking Jim for